Welcome back to the second volume of Faculty in Focus, where we blur the lines between the work done by Ohio State Lima faculty and the greater Allen County community. I'm your host, Maggie Young, and throughout Faculty in Focus, we will explore Ohio State Lima faculty interests and how they relate to the greater Allen County region. For our second volume of Faculty in Focus, we decided to talk about faculty firsts. There's so much excitement and novelty with the start of a new school year. I thought it might be interesting to look at how our faculty developed their teaching and research skills. Today, we have Dr. Mark Kleffner, Professor of Earth Science and our Associate Dean on campus. And he's going to share a bit about his experience as a teacher at Ohio State. So, Mark, thank you so much for coming and joining us today.
You're welcome.
I wanted to start by asking you about your first class, the first one that you taught. And you could talk about it, in a variety of different modalities or situations, but I'd love to hear about kind of how you started this teaching journey.
Sure. My teaching journey started as a graduate student, and I had an opportunity as a TA to start out in the small way that a lot of TAs do, and that is in a lab. And geology labs at that time were, the one I was assigned to was students could come at any time, check out basically a tray of materials, take it to a carrel, work on them. If they had questions, raise their hand. Otherwise, just do it and then come up. And we were sitting at the front of the room and we would check off their lab sheet. Sometimes I get a chance to go around and answer students' questions. And that was the most fun thing. Checking the labs was not really much in the way of teaching, just grading. And I'd already been assigned some of that. But that kind of got me started. And I really, I'm a rather shy person ordinarily, or at least I was, especially back then. And so that kind of enabled me to see, yeah, I can do this. I enjoyed the shyness went away when I was explaining geology topics to students and trying to help them. And then I was extremely fortunate that when I was on a fellowship, when you're supposed to be doing nothing but working on your project, they were short lectures in geology at Ohio State, and they were really hard up, and they were asking graduate students, does anybody want to teach this evening introductory to earth sciences class? And I said, well, if I'm permitted to do so, sure. I'd really love the experience because I think I'd like to go into the university teaching and not work in the oil industry or something like that. So I got an evening class, and that was my introduction to teaching. Not a huge class yet, but about 50 students, and just thrown into it. And I basically just taught the textbook. I think what most people think we do is we just get a textbook and we just, the students bring their textbook to class, at least in the old days, and you just sort of go through the textbook. And essentially that was what I did. I basically prepared a little bit of notes based on the textbook, and we went through chapter by chapter, and I covered the entire textbook in one quarter, and the students were probably extremely overwhelmed. And I always left every evening just totally whipped from the class because my hand was tired from writing on the blackboard. Because back in the 80s when this happened, overheads were not even used all that regularly yet. So we were doing an awful lot of chalk talk and an occasional overhead and handouts. But even the handouts were not just go to a Xerox machine and run them off. You had to basically go to a mimeograph machine, and you'd have to have that run off with the department secretary because we weren't allowed to use that. So it was interesting. It was a fun experience. It was I guess I enjoyed it enough that they had an opening again. That was winter, and I got asked, and they needed somebody for spring, so I did it again. And I learned a little bit, did a few more overheads, a little bit less chalk talk, but still not a whole lot of hands-on. It was just me lecturing in some way. So that was the start. And I guess because that was the mode at that time, it seemed to go pretty well. No real complaints from the students that I was overwhelming them, at least not too many complaints. Pretty good reviews. And then that was the last I had an opportunity to teach, other than one other. I was an RA after that. And so I didn't get a chance to teach again until essentially I graduated. And then I got the OSU experience. They needed somebody to lecture in the big classrooms in Mendenhall, where you could have as many as 250 students in the classroom. And that was an interesting experience too. There was, by that time, the late 80s, we were into using overheads a little more and slides. No PowerPoint back then or anything like that, but occasionally used to slide projectors. But still, though, largely me just giving the material on the board, lots of writing, handouts again, lots of handouts because lots of students, lots of grading, although grading was different back then too. For the really large classes, we gave the typical, well, I gave anyway, and it was pretty standard multiple choice tests. And then you took them over to, I think it was Lincoln Tower, and there was a place there where they graded them, and we could have them checked off for how the bottom quarter of the class did, how the top quarter of the students did, so we could see which questions were bad questions, good questions. And that was really instrumental in how I began to start teaching from then on, because I saw that whenever I gave a reading assignment but didn't cover it in lecture, nobody got the questions right. So if I gave them something to read in the textbook, I said, okay, you're responsible for this. I'd cover other things and then expect them to understand it from just their reading. It didn't happen. It showed that nobody was getting it. Now, maybe nobody did the reading at all, and that's the reason. It wasn't they didn't understand it, they just didn't do the reading. Or if they did it, so from then on, after I taught that first quarter and saw those results, I quit giving any material or doing any material I didn't also cover in class. So I didn't give them outside reading or reading in the textbook, and then not also go over that in the textbook. I always covered the material, made sure, because I knew they weren't going to get it. So that started one of the things I've kept my entire teaching career, never to assign something outside and then just test on it without going or covering it in class, even if you're trying to get a certain amount of work covered because you felt obligated. Back then, I kind of felt obligated to cover the textbook, but I learned quickly there that I couldn't cover a textbook that way. That wasn't working. So I had to decide, well, am I going to keep my pace up or not? And unfortunately, back then, I still decided, well, they bought this book. I should, use the book. So I kept trying to teach pretty much the whole book. And so there was my experience before I got the position here at Ohio State Lima. I taught really big classes to lots of students. The difference was, though, I didn't have any interaction with them in lab. We didn't have to. And on the main campus, the professor teaching the lecture wasn't required to do anything with the labs. That was always assigned to TAs. And for the courses I was teaching, or the course I was teaching, that meant that those students were going to, again, basically a really large room that had lab trays they could check out, just like I was doing as a grad student. So what I did, because I felt that it was kind of important there's no way I'm going to learn 250 students. I'm just not good at that. But I could at least go to those labs occasionally, could walk in and for maybe an hour a day, a couple of days a week, just go around. Since I wasn't required to be there, I didn't have to check off lab books. I just wandered the room a few times and say, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'm going to be here for the next hour or so. I'm a professor of this section of that course, but I'm happy to answer your questions anyway if you have some. I walk around for an hour or so and answer students' questions, and I really enjoyed that. And most of the students turned out to be ones not in my class, but it didn't matter. It was an opportunity to work with those students, and so I really enjoyed that. And then I had an opportunity after 1 year of being a lecturer to come to the Lima campus and teach. I was only hired on a 1 year as a replacement because a job search had failed here, and they needed somebody to teach both geography and geology. And it turned out I was actually hired by the chair of geography to come here for a year and teach courses until they could do a search again. And that was also very interesting because that position required me to teach geography. And I hadn't even taken a single geography course at university level. And I had to teach my first quarter in world regional geography and physical geography plus a couple geology courses. I think just one, because I was only teaching 3 courses a quarter. And physical geography wasn't a real big stretch because it was largely physical geology plus weather. Okay, so that didn't make me sweat, or I wasn't worried too much about that. But world regional geography was very interesting because I had not done anything with world geography since maybe high school, and not even my first year in high school. So I was assigned autumn quarter to this course. I had 50 students in it. And I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? This is a real challenge because I can't look like I don't know anything. I I've got to be a teacher, right? So I've got to know more than them. So I did something I would never do under ordinary circumstances, but I did back then because I wanted to make it at least look like I knew something that wasn't in the textbook. So I had them get one textbook. I stuck with the textbook they've been using, but I basically asked for and acquired 2 other textbooks to review for potentially adopting. I had no intention of adopting them, but I wanted them for references. So I just started basically taking notes on the same material in those textbooks, just a little different than what I was using to prepare for class. So although I was covering the topics in our class textbook, I did it with information that wasn't just out of that textbook. So it didn't look like I was teaching right from the textbook. It looked like I sort of knew a little bit about it. And I didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare because I wasn't asked until about middle of the summer, I think, that we were going to start in September. I said about a month, and I started preparing a little bit, but ended up what I was doing, and this is probably typical for any faculty member teaching a course for the first time, but out of your discipline, maybe even more so, because that usually doesn't happen. I would teach the course based on, in most cases, what I spent the night before, right after I got home, got back to the apartment with my wife. I'd have dinner with my wife, and then I'd go to our extra bedroom at that time, and with those 2 books, and I'd just start taking notes. And I develop a lecture outline for the next day. And I was doing that every evening, because back then you teach 5 days a week. And
Right.
so I was doing it every evening. And sometimes I wouldn't quite get done, but I'd have to give up for the night because I was just burned out taking notes and trying to organize them. So in my office the next day, oftentimes even minutes before class, I was finishing off my notes. And then to give me something on world regional that I knew a little bit about, I did something that probably no other world regional geography class ever covered in the detail that I did, and that was natural resources for all the countries I talked about. So it gave me a chance to talk about the rocks and minerals and lakes and rivers and streams and everything. So I felt comfortable at least a little bit about something in that country I knew about. And so I made it through that semester, or pardon me, that quarter. And I learned a lot about how to prepare and, go in. I can't say that I wasn't a little bit nervous every time I went into class, because I knew that at any time they could ask a question that easily I wouldn't have an answer for. And I was ready to say, I don't really know that one for sure, but I'll look it up. But I was afraid I was going to have to say that way too often. And fortunately, nobody ever asked those kinds of questions. And so I felt pretty comfortable. And then I'm comfortable enough that course was scheduled again for the next quarter. And not only was it scheduled again, but they asked, would you like to do a double section of that? And so we, instead of teaching 50, I taught it to 100 in one of the biggest classrooms in Galvin Hall at that time. And I did 100 that time. It was the classrooms that had a stage in Galvin. So I was basically performing on a stage for something I still didn't know all that much about for another quarter. And it went really well. I got nice reviews. It was like they thought I really knew what I was teaching about. And I did for what I talked about, but had I gone off that at all. And so I learned how to prepare for a course that you don't really have much background in really well. Mm-hmm. And then that prepared me for when I finally got to teach just earth science courses. And I quickly learned from geography, or not quickly, that it's tough to cover an entire textbook. That didn't work so well. So I came out of that experience with, all right, you got to start to begin to pick and choose a bit. The first geology courses I taught during the same first year teaching geography courses, I still was trying to teach the whole textbook, but it was too much for me and too much for the students. So I learned that it's better to do more with less, essentially. So I began to pick and choose topics that I thought were the ones that related most to students in our region. I kept the idea that you still don't have them read outside the textbook, or read in the textbook and not cover it in class, or read anything else not covered in class. But then I also began to cut down what they had to read in the textbook, and occasionally bring in out of textbook things, especially in the news, but not yet. That still had to evolve. And I've then taught geology courses or science courses for many, many years, and using a fewer topics, but still mostly overheads. In fact, the first geology courses I taught, we were still using 16 millimeter film strips on the Lima campus. You don't see that used anywhere anymore, anywhere.
No. No.
Kent State University had a really nice library of geology, 15, 16 millimeter film strips. I'd rent them and I usually showed 3 or 4 or so each quarter. And they were the ones I chose, I thought were really good. So I tried to break lecture up with a little more stuff than just black and white overheads, because that's all they basically were, except for the colored acetates that you could get for using textbooks. But then you were just using a figure from a textbook, which students could look at anyway. So I wanted to do something different. And I continued to teach that way for for a lot of my career. And then technology began to come in a bit more. And we had VHSs when I first started, but not a whole lot of VHS cassettes to show. But then those started to become more prevalent, and I started using those in classes, the appropriate topics. I used a slide projector quite a bit back then, and bought a lot of slides. And I had acquired slides from a geology professor who retired in Columbus, and I tried to work those into my classes to give more things than what you could get out of just the textbook. And I continued that, and then as I've taught more and more years, we began to recognize that, the professors stand up, and I never read out of a textbook, but just basically teaching the textbook, even with overheads and a few other things thrown in, isn't the best way to teach. Ideally, active learning is really good. So how can I begin to do that? Well, the largest classes I've ever had are double sections of labs, so maybe up to 70. And I decided, I've got all these rocks and minerals and fossils I teach about, and I've been sort of holding up or showing videos of. I could make packages of them, put together sets, and then have them use them in lecture in addition to them getting to use them in lab. So about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I developed enough sets of rocks and minerals and fossils that they could be shared between, say, 3 or 4 of the students sitting close to each other in lecture. And I began to, instead of just talking about demonstrating how you do mineral hardness tests and identification tests and demonstrations for how you're supposed to identify fossils, I'd let the students learn how to do it sort of hands-on in the lecture. And that proved to be really helpful, because then they went into lab really understanding, well, ideally really understanding how to do the same thing again in lab, requiring a little bit less help from me in lab, which allowed me to spend more time with the students in lab who really didn't understand it, as opposed to spending time with all the lab groups, because nobody had done it themselves yet, just saw how I did it as a demonstration in front of the class. When you're 50 or 100 feet away, that demonstration doesn't work as well as it does when you're doing it in person and doing it with your classmates. So I did that for all my classes. And I first started out by still guiding them through it. And then I started to have them begin to do more of everything themselves, like dump out a bunch of minerals and say, okay, how would you determine that these are even minerals? What's the difference between a mineral and a rock? In fact, I began starting my intro earth science class with that. Now, here's what everybody thinks earth science is all about. It's about rocks and minerals. So we're going to start with it. So here's a bag of what are mostly minerals, but there are some rocks. What's the difference? I'm not going to tell you. Take a look and see if you can figure out why some of these are rocks and all the rest are minerals. And they'd look and look and look, and eventually some of them might hit on the fact that, well, it looks like most of them are just one solid color, whatever, but others look like they're little pieces. I say that's it. A rock is an aggregate of minerals, and a mineral is what makes up most of the rocks. So that's to get them to start making the decisions. And then we get into minerals. I say, okay, well, what makes those minerals minerals? What is a mineral? And I'd have, instead, again, just simply in the old days, I would have just lectured, listed the things on a board. This is what makes a substance a mineral. Instead, I'd have them try to figure it out for themselves. And that, again, got them more into it. And so for the next 4 or 5 years, that was a part of my class, maybe even a little longer than that. And then Ohio State University instituted, they had a teaching institute, and it was the University Institute for Teaching and Learning. And I got asked to be a mentor, in part because I was fortunate enough to be awarded a teaching award back in a few years before they started the institute. And I got asked to join this because of that. And I said, well, okay, I'm sure. This is interesting because I was thinking that they're going to have all these new techniques that I don't use, and I'm going to be the one teaching people teaching to use these new techniques. This isn't going to, it'd be interesting to see how this works. A person who's been teaching without a whole lot of the new technology or new teaching styles, some active learning, but not all of the stuff. But it turned out that was an incredible experience, and I continued to do it for 5 years because I was able to relate what I did and worked in my classes, plus the information that I was given to pass on to my mentees was a great education for me. And my mentees educated me in some ways because most of them were teaching for the first time or had maybe taught somewhere else for a little bit. And they had some methods I hadn't thought of using. So I started implementing some new things where, in addition to the hands-on learning and the classroom active learning, I started with geology in the news. I started out class with someone would share something they just saw on the news that day, turn it in. What has to, something about in the news that relates to our class. And everybody had an opportunity to do that, and they get an extra credit point for doing so. And so again, trying to make the class more relevant, bringing students into it, get them more interested in the topic. And that ended up working really well. So I kept with that and expanded on that a bit. So instead of just necessarily starting every day with that, I modified it a bit, and I had students in the first day of class write down any question they'd like to have an answer for in geology. And I would answer one of those a day until I ran out of them for our classes. And then I began giving them assignments that you need to, during the semester, submit one geology in the news that has to do with something in the news, and then also geology in your life. And during the semester, write down something that is geology related. So maybe it's something in your house made of a mineral we talked about, or a rock we talked about, or maybe it's landscape, whatever. And so again, try to bring the course, the class, the topics in it to the students. Again, relevance. I think it's really important, especially if you're teaching a course like I am, intro courses in earth sciences. And we have no earth science majors on this campus. We have like maybe 12 degrees that we're offering, and none of them in the earth sciences. So I'm only going to get students who are probably taking this to fulfill a GE, but I want them to come out ideally with an interest in science. That, most of them, I would say a large majority of the students who take my courses were there because they had to have a GE in science, and they decided that earth science or geology was probably easier than physics or chemistry, maybe even in biology. So this was the easy way out. And I've tried to make the case that it's not any easier per se, but it's not a difficult. Science as a whole isn't necessarily difficult, and it is interesting. And I tried to make it so that at a minimum, I didn't expect to have students come out deciding they're going to major in earth science or geology, but I was hoping to have students come out to see that science actually is relevant to their lives, earth science is relevant to their lives, and maybe they might take one more course with me. So I'd have students that might take another course I teach, and I get to see some of the good students again. So basically, that's sort of how things have evolved over time in terms of how I've taught. I've tried to go more and more active learning, try to bring students into the class. I really love labs, and we'd never do a lab until we covered the topic in class. So they already at least were exposed to it. And then when labs are on, I don't just stand at the front of the room and sort of, stand there and wait till they're done. I walk around the room the whole time and check to see how they're doing, and raise their hands. I answer questions. If they don't raise their hands, I'm peeking over their shoulders. And I said, if I can see you're getting answers that aren't correct, I'm going to stop and work with the group anyway and guide you to the correct answer. I said, lab is all about not necessarily getting the correct answer the first time, because this is all new. Even though we've done it in lecture, it's still all new. But it's about gaining the understanding of how to eventually get the answer. And hopefully after I've helped you in the lab and you've done the lab, if I ask similar questions again, then you'll have an understanding of how to get to the answers. It's not memorizing answers, it's learning how to come up with the answers by working with the materials and getting used to it. And I just kept doing that. And lab has been, I've enjoyed lab probably more than any other aspect, because it is the chance to work with the students hands-on. And that's why I've loved being here on this campus so much for the now 33rd year that I'm here. It's the opportunity to work with students that closely, hands-on. And I've had I accepted a job somewhere where you just lecture, like I did when I was a lecturer on the Columbus campus, I would never have had to done labs with undergraduates. Graduate students, yes, but I would never had to do labs with undergraduates. And I think that's where it really is the most important to do hands-on with students, with someone who really enjoys it and has an opportunity to pass on that knowledge and passion and interest and get them interested as an undergraduate. Because, obviously the graduates kept going because they were interested. But now is the chance to get students who might not ever really think much about science or earth science, really get them having some appreciation and some understanding for how, even if they never do anything else in earth science, next time they're on a vacation, they might drive through the Rocky Mountains and see, oh, look at those rocks, yeah, or look at that formation there, or they're in Ohio and say, well, hey, that's one of those glacial formations we talked about. That's why it looks like that. I've always wondered, when before it wouldn't have, they would have made it would have been no connection. They wouldn't have had the fun of understanding what it is they were looking at. They would just say, oh, that's a hill. Well, it's a hill because a glacier dumped that hill behind. That's why it's there. So it's been I've really enjoyed and still enjoy teaching, even though I'm an associate dean and don't do it very much anymore. I relish the opportunities when I still get to do it, because I think that's really what I do best over anything else, an opportunity to work one-on-one with students and attempt to pass on my passion and interest and love for the science in a way that maybe a little bit rubs off on them.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, I am just so glad that you were able to join us for this episode of Faculty in Focus. I want to congratulate you on joining the select group of OSU Lima faculty invited to our little mug club as part of our focus on faculty scholarship, both inside and outside of the classroom. For all of you watching at home, be sure to check out our other episodes of Faculty in Focus on the Ohio State Lima YouTube channel. And from all of us here at OSU Lima, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Faculty in Focus. Until next time.